Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Patrizia Fracassi. I'm Senior Officer in the Food and Nutrition Division, and I will moderate this session towards coherent and effective action, aligning biodiversity and nutrition instruments. Before proceeding, I'd first like to run through some practical information to ensure the smooth running of the event. Please be informed that this event will be recorded and is being webcast. The recording of this event will be made available online on the FAO and the UN Nutrition website. For those of you who are active on social media, please use the hashtag for this event, hashtag RNW2025. The full program is available by scanning the QR code on the right-hand side screen. Distinguished speaker and guests, please follow the meeting in mute and click the unmute button only when speaking. The meeting will be conducted in English. If you would like to pose a question to the panelists, please use the question and answer feature or raise your hand in the room, and one of our messengers will bring you the microphone. If you would like to make a comment, including questions or concern to the audiovisual technicians, please include them in the box. Thank you everyone for your collaboration. To formally open our session, I have the honor of inviting Ms. Astrid Schumacher, Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Astrid?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, but we cannot see you. Thank you for being with us.
So my camera is switched on, so if you can't see me, that's probably an issue at your end, but I think it's now resolved. So colleagues, Excellencies, it's really a pleasure to participate in this event, and greetings from Montreal. For us, this is a very important session. When I say for us, it's the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have our headquarters here in Montreal, and we see food security and nutrition depend on biodiversity, and then the genetic diversity found in crop varieties and livestock breeds forming the foundation of our diet. So in other words, biodiversity conservation and sustainable use are, in our view, essential to improving food security and nutrition. And I think we have a meeting of minds there with our colleagues in the FAO. And of course, also conversely, nutrition-related agendas can contribute to achieving many targets of our Conway Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a bit like the Paris Agreement for nature. So if I say that biodiversity and nutrition are mutually reinforcing, it also means that they must be pursued through integrated policies, and that breaking down policy and institutional silos is an imperative. And we often talk about that, and it is our hope that the session, the discussion we're going to have today will make a contribution to that. What we are seeing is that in many parts of the world, of course, wild food species do form an integral part of local diets and are essential for the nutrition and livelihoods of indigenous peoples and local communities. But nonetheless, our current global agri-food system remains excessively reliant on a very limited number of species, breeds, and varieties. And as diversity diminishes, agri-food systems then become increasingly vulnerable to pests, to diseases, of course, also market shocks, and the impacts of climate change. So what we are discussing today, I think, is also really a resilience agenda. So we hope that we can seize the opportunity of this week to advocate for policies that recognize this vital nexus between biodiversity, nutrition, and health, and that by this greater recognition of nutritious and neglected crops and underutilized varieties and existing crops, we can push diversity into focus, because diversity really is key to sustaining both nature's and people's nutrition. So we see a need to promote underutilized species, so well-designed value chains that advance biodiversity conservation while also ensuring access to healthy and nutritious food for all. And we've been working on that for quite a while. There is a program of work in our Convention on Agricultural Biodiversity that was adopted many, many years ago at COP9 in Brazil. And the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity then launched the Initiative on Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition. And then more recently, that was in 2006, and more recently at COP16, the parties to the convention, and it was in Cali last year in Colombia, emphasized the importance of implementing this initiative in line with the global biodiversity framework. And then they invited the FAO to develop a plan of action for that purpose. And yeah, so these are all priority themes on the program of the Rome Nutrition Week, linking biodiversity, food, nutrition, to say it again, through a range of concrete measures. The initiative can support efforts to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, promote the sustainable use of genetic resources, strengthen policy coherence, and again, strengthen the resilience of our agri-food systems. So today, I think we're looking forward to discussion how we can better collaborate across sectors, across organizations, across the Atlantic. And I hope that the solutions shared today, along with the reflections and the discussion, will help us to see where support is needed, will contribute to the action plan that FAO is developing on the initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition. And of course, yeah, will help us accelerate and join efforts to secure a more diverse, resilient, and nutritious future for all of us. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Astrid, for setting the scene. We are honored to have CBD participate in the Rome Nutrition Week. To further contextualize today's discussion, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Kaved Zaidi, Director of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at FAO. Kaved, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to join this event and to join the conversation on aligning biodiversity and nutrition instruments. And it's a particular pleasure to follow on from Astrid, because FAO and the CBD Secretariat have really a long-standing collaboration exactly on this agenda from the very early formation of the convention. I think our gathering today brings, to some extent, together stakeholders and experts from these three areas, biodiversity, nutrition, and agriculture. And of course, the strongest thread that binds together these three areas is food and agriculture. The interdependence of biodiversity and agriculture is crystal clear. Again, Astrid talked about that. Maybe less appreciated is that diverse diets also tend to be more nutritious, but what we see today is a food system that probably is not optimizing nutrition and it's not optimizing diversity. So that's the current stage. Again, Astrid mentioned that of the 6,000 or so plant species that humans have cultivated for food over time, just 3 of them, rice and wheat and maize, produce over 60% of our calories. So we are becoming dependent on a narrower and narrower selection of diversity for our food. And of course, a global food system that depends on such a narrow selection of plants is going to be more vulnerable to diseases, more vulnerable to pests, and of course, more vulnerable to climate extremes, as well as delivering less nutritious food to our plates. So achieving food security and nutrition is not only a sort of a technical question of nutrients, it's a fundamental question about our agri-food systems and the ones that we have chosen. And to deliver on a healthy and nutritious diet, we need an agri-food system that is quite different. It needs to deliver on resilience, it needs to be sustainable, and again, it needs to have biodiversity and diversity at its core. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was passed by the CBD provides, I think, a really good starting point for doing just that, as do then the national biodiversity strategies and action plans that countries have to put together for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I say it's a good starting point, it's because at central to it is the sustainable use of biodiversity that then lends itself much better and much closer to a sort of sustainable and resilient agriculture and food systems, the kind of work that we have been advocating and promoting. We have to say that if you take stock right now, it's not brilliant, because currently about just a third of these strategies, these national biodiversity strategies and action plans, make the connection between biodiversity and nutrition. And an even smaller number, less than 4%, have concrete plans to mobilize resources to take action that addresses nutrition. So this part of the story is still not as visible and complete within the biodiversity conversation. That's why that we at FAO, at COP16 in Cali, we launched the Agri-NBSAP Support Initiative in collaboration with the Presidency, the Government of Colombia, and of course, Astrid and the CBD Secretariat, to begin to help countries translate these big GBF commitments into national pathways and actions, and ones that are perfectly conscious of the nutrition, biodiversity, food security, the whole realm that they need to cover. And that's the program that we're using to offer technical assistance, policy support, country-driven collaboration to basically help the countries make their biodiversity plans compatible with the level of ambition that the global biodiversity framework now has, including Target 10, of course, on sustainable agriculture. FAO has also been supporting the CBD initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition. Again, Astrid mentioned that. That's long-standing. That started in 2006, so it's been going for quite a while. The latest decision at the resume meeting of COP16 that we happily hosted here at FAO headquarters in February, I think just added further impetus to that journey. But as that journey evolves, we see we're getting loaded with more and more. Are you doing enough on nutrition? Are you doing enough on biodiversity? Where is the climate element? It keeps getting loaded, and it needs to get loaded with all of those elements. That action plan is just another concrete example of the collaboration we have with the CBD on aligning these biodiversity, nutrition, agriculture agendas. Another instrument we have, and I want to leave it with you because sometimes it's overlooked a little bit, are the voluntary guidelines for mainstreaming biodiversity into policies, programs, national and regional plans of action on nutrition. The voluntary guidelines for mainstreaming biodiversity into policies, programs, and national and regional plans of action on nutrition endorsed by the Commission on genetic resources for food and agriculture. It's another great platform that we have that brings these agendas together, but is sometimes overlooked. And it needs to be part of this response that we're trying to build together, bringing a confederation of all of the different elements that we already have in place, because it's an instrument for us to work with countries to make the best use of genetic resources and biodiversity, including for their nutrition programs. I'm sure that across the group gathered here today, there are many, many more. We've been talking about it in different sessions of the Nutrition Week today and early in the week. And we hope that through the session we'll be able to take stock a little bit more of the instruments that exist, the initiatives, the good practices that deliver on both biodiversity and nutrition, and hopefully on climate as well, and then begin to piece them together in a way that adds more momentum to the action that has to take place, which is, of course, on the ground, in and with the countries. So again, thank you for allowing me to set a little bit the scene from our perspective as well. Patricia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your introduction, which effectively frame the discussion to come. Before our distinguished experts present their examples, let's consider the fundamental linkages between biodiversity and nutrition. Enabling access and consumption of healthy diets, those that are adequate, diverse, balanced, and moderate in the consumption of unhealthy food, is crucial to prevent all forms of malnutrition and improve health outcomes across different country contexts. Diversity is key to the relationship between biodiversity and healthy diet. Biodiversity for food and nutrition exists at the ecosystem, species, and the genetic levels. There is a wide variety of nutrient content across and within species, as exemplified here for vitamin A-rich and vitamin C-rich foods. This diversity can make the difference between adequate and inadequate nutrient intake. We conducted an exploratory review on the relationship between biodiversity and diets, examining all 4 principles of healthy diets. Of the study included, 74 analyzed the impact of biodiversity, mostly plant genetic resources, on diet adequacy and diversity. Meanwhile, only 26% of studies explored how dietary patterns affect biodiversity, focusing on the consumption of red meat and predominantly plant-based diets. A foreseen systematic review will provide deeper insights into this relationship to understand how we can better meet health and environmental goals. The initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition builds on evidence and knowledge, element 1, integrates research and policy, element 2, promotes biodiversity practices for enhanced food and nutrition, element 3, and raises public awareness with consistent evidence-informed messaging, element 4. Based on these 4 elements, now that's the question to our experts, what can be done to best support the parties in their efforts to implement the Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition initiative? I will now give the floor to 5 experts in their field to discuss one example in 3 minutes. I know it's a challenging task, but I'm sure that you will excel. So I will start first with Ms. Teresa Borelli, scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, echoing the words of my colleagues, I think the most important or the crucial thing is how do we actually harness this biodiversity for food and nutrition, and how do we implement the cross-cutting initiative effectively? So given the short time I have available today, I will only focus on elements 1 and 2, as Patrizia was saying. And I'd like to share with you examples from the Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition project, a Jeff-funded project that was implemented between 2012 and 2019, and that was coordinated globally by the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT in collaboration with UNEP and FAO. So just to say, it was a country-driven project. It was initiated by Brazil, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. 4 countries that are considered mega diverse, are very rich in agricultural biodiversity, but at the same time riddled with malnutrition, burdened with high levels of malnutrition. So today I will focus on the Brazil example and give you a flavor of what can be achieved with essentially with strong cross-sectoral collaboration and partnerships, using the initiative, the cross-cutting initiative that was mentioned, as guidance. So I'll focus on the research policy, as I said, and looking into how evidence was used to influence and change policy within Brazil. And so let's get into the nitty-gritty, and I'll show you exactly how. So first of all, I should say that Brazil decided to work at the federal level, so across the entire country, contrarily to Kenya that was looking at the subnational level. But essentially what it did is it took advantage of this Plants for the Future initiative that you can see, which had already identified species of nutritional and economic importance for Brazil. And it used that data to prioritize a number of native species for further food composition work. It worked across all the 5 ecoregions of Brazil. So it collaborated, established strong partnerships with academia, with research centers, and across the 7 years of implementation, I think we managed to involve at least 100 between professors, researchers, and students. And the data then fed into the National Food Composition Database of Brazil, but also then into the FAO in Foods database on biodiversity. So what happened then? Looking back on the right side, at the policy side, the other interesting part about Brazil is that it took advantage of an established policy platform that was established under the Zero Hunger program that had already brought a lot of sectors together. So it had Ministry of Environment, Education, Health, Ministry of Social Development, so it already had established this platform. And the data was then used to, for example, to update the food-based dietary guidelines of the Brazilian population that you see in light blue below, but also I think someone was mentioning about updating or revising the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and including targets that recognize the importance of biodiversity for food and nutrition, for furthering strategies that looked at food and nutrition security within Brazil. And last but not least, data generated via the project was actually used to publish law. It's a socio-biodiversity ordinance that was published in 2018, spearheaded by the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Social Development. It recognized the 70 native species that were analyzed during the course of the project, and this made it, or enabled smallholder farmers that were already engaging in producing or collecting the species to then be able to access public procurement programs such as the Food Acquisition Program and the National School Feeding Program. So how did this, let's talk about the tangible results other than the policy. There was increased budgets devoted to biodiversity for food and nutrition and biodiversity nutrition actions, and then also increased spending on socio-biodiversity. And so what can we learn from the Brazil experience? We need to use low-hanging fruits, identify what platforms are already available within the country, those entry points that are different for each country, so no one-size-fits-all. That malnutrition cannot be solved by a single sector. We really need to have this collective action across sectors, and that we need to turn evidence into policy. And for those who want more information, I provided a QR code on the top right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. So next speaker is Ms. Fatima Hachem, Senior Nutrition Officer in FAO's Food and Nutrition Division. Fatima, over to you.
Thank you, Patricia. Actually, in my team, we work on assisting countries develop and implement dietary guidelines. And the question I'm responding to today is how dietary guidelines can be effective in promoting both health and nutrition and biodiversity. The simple answer to this question is yes, definitely. Dietary guidelines can be an effective tool in answering to these two objectives. However, having said that, there are some conditions to be met. Just to remind ourselves of what dietary guidelines are, in most countries, they were developed as a tool for food and nutrition education to inform consumers on how to eat in a healthy way. However, over more than 10 years now, countries have started to integrate considerations of sustainability in their dietary guidelines, and including biodiversity. Now, the process for developing dietary guidelines is really based on scientific evidence and on linkages between foods, patterns, dietary patterns, and health, and also more recently on the relationship on many environmental indicators. Now, in reviewing some of the science base of these dietary guidelines, where, like in Brazil, in Canada, in the Nordic countries, where there has been analysis on the impact of dietary patterns and biodiversity, we saw that this is part of the analysis. Now, looking at the consumer-facing recommendations in the dietary guidelines, because the dietary guidelines are not only the consumer-facing recommendations, we see that in most of these countries, there are no explicit recommendations on promoting biodiversity. What do we see? In most of these dietary guidelines, we see statements or recommendations like promoting diverse plant-based diets, as Patricia said, with the assumption that this supports agrobiodiversity by encouraging cultivation of a wider range of crops. In the same vein, we see that in some guidelines, there's a promotion of the seasonal foods, which is seen as an indirect way of reducing dependence on monocultures and the global food systems that harm ecosystems. Or yet we can see a recommendation on reducing animal source foods, especially from industrial livestock, as this could lower pressure on land, water, and biodiversity. Or sometimes we can see recommendations to encourage consumption of traditional foods. In fact, I'm happy that, to say that it's in my speaking points that Brazil is the only example that we know of that has gone one step further and have recommended actually the consumption of natural or minimally processed foods in great variety and mainly of plant origin that are supportive of socially and environmentally sustainable food systems with considerations for biodiversity, as we've just heard. So the question here is whether this is enough to preserve or to promote biodiversity or not do harm for biodiversity. And questions like, can't we consume plant-based diets that are varied among food groups but not within the same food group, or less within cultivars of the same foods? Could we not be producing harm to biodiversity by promoting some foods in relation to others? So dietary guidelines can be effective tools, actually, as I said before, for both purposes, but this depends on the way they have been developed, they have been implemented, and they have been communicated. So here I would like to emphasize 3 points. The importance of evidence on the nutritional composition of different cultivars or underutilized species and how they impact nutrition, because we don't always have the evidence. We need more food composition work in this area to build on the evidence, and I'm happy to say that on Friday there is a session on food composition. Also, the unintended consequences of promoting components of diets on a wide array of sociocultural and environmental dimensions needs to be assessed and monitored. We need actually a balanced perspective on benefits and drawbacks of what we are promoting. And then there is the importance of involving stakeholders from different sectors, and it was said, I think, in the earlier session, from different sectors and different levels of the agri-food system in the process of developing and implementing dietary guidelines so that there is better coherence between policies and there are enabling policies for the availability, the affordability, and the accessibility of the biodiverse food. So this is why FAO has elaborated a new methodology, and this methodology, you can see its title is Food Systems-Based Dietary Guidelines. This methodology, in fact, considers the challenges, constraints, and connections within the agri-food system to assist countries do exactly the same thing, addressing the nutritional priorities and also taking into account other commitments that are aligned with the national priorities. And I invite you to look at our overview that is online, or you can scan it. We will be launching this methodology in August, and we hope that it will lead to the generation of new sets of dietary guidelines that integrate whatever the countries consider as priority in terms of health and nutrition and environmental impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima and Teresa. We are now moving to the element 3 of the initiative. And let me now welcome Pilar Santacoloma, Nutrition and Food Systems Officer in FAO's Food and Nutrition Division. Pilar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I will bring an example from a project in Mexico to illustrate the connection between biodiversity, nutrition, and markets. This project was implemented between 2018 and 2023, and it contributes to the elements 3 and 4 of the initiative on biodiversity and food nutrition of the Convention on Biodiversity, which are mainly aiming at conserving and promoting wider use of biodiversity for food and nutrition, while raising consumer and policy awareness. The objective of this project was valorizing agrobiodiversity in a milpa system. This is an ancient system from the Maya culture, based on maize, beans, and pumpkins, but had many other kind of vegetables and medicinal plants to renew traditional cuisine, cultural heritage, and local markets. To achieve this goal, valorizing the agrobiodiversity precisely in moment where we rely on very few crops, was needed to implement a multiple approach, which consider first searching on the food composition of these agrobiodiversity products and communicating the nutritional value, supporting the agroecological production of these agri-food systems, promoting sharing the experience and knowledge and seeds among producers through fairs, promoting also the consumption of these products through different kinds of local markets, farmer markets, shared gastronomic events, and preparing some kind of communication events for TV, for radio, to position the collective mark ABAT, which is translates flavors and knowledge from the agrobiodiversity. The project was running in 6 states in Mexico, and the results are clearly increased the use of biodiversity first, with the establishing 77 seed banks at community and farm level, improving the milpa system. There are a lot of dynamics in the milpa system, and there have been improved in 177 communities, increasing biodiversity directly in 5,000 hectares, but expanding to more than 1,000 hectares indirectly, and increasing the sales of diverse nutritious foods in markets, because that is the core element of the strategy. I mean, how to increase the use of biodiversity if it's not expanding through market mechanisms, the use of the biodiversity, and teaching how to use them and how to incorporate in the diet. So these kind of initiatives are definitely having an impact, and in case of Mexico, there was a policy incidence because they were the element of agrobiodiversity was inserted and considered in different program and strategies, particularly on food and nutrition at the national level. So There is an approach tested and relatively easy to scale up and replicate in other places. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. We now turn to the critical role of engaging youth. And I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Kazuki Kitaoka, Director of the Office of Youth and Women at FAO. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And I will use my 3 minutes to talk a bit about youth, as we think that youth very often are being taken as pure beneficiaries, pure recipients of funding, of knowledge. But in fact, what we see in particular when it's coming to the implementation, the sustainable implementation of any kind of policy, is that we need to think about youth as real actors, as real empowered agents of change that would bring and that will bring a long-term solution, long-term structures that we need for the implementation of also this important initiative that on biodiversity for food and nutrition. And of course, it was very good news to see that the CBD already included some youth in the consultation processes in one way or another. There were youth both in Colombia and also here in Rome present. And overall, youth, I think, were quite positive about the establishment of this initiative. As we could see in many consultations we had with young people, youth really envision a future where which conserves and enhances biodiversity rather than threatening it when it's coming to the future of our food systems, our agri-food systems, and the future of our food overall. With that, I would like to point at two different initiatives. You have here the overall Global Youth Action Initiative that we are implementing for the last 5 years. And two of them are linking specifically on the implementation of policies and breaking them from a global level and bringing them to national, well, regional, national, provincial, local realities, and hopefully helping in the implementation of them through the structures that we are helping putting in place. At the global level, the Youth Assembly that was created by young people for young people just 5 years ago has decided this year, and actually for those who have not seen the Youth Assembly in action, we are talking here about an increasingly representative group of thousands of young people who are discussing all the different aspects of agri-food systems in structured consultations over the year, which then cumulates at the World Food Forum in final discussions and outcome papers. And in this Youth Assembly for 2025, the Assembly members have decided that they will host assessments and capacity building and consultation workshops to shape a youth recommendation following the initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition. So this is an immediate follow-up, actually, that young people, without anything else that we needed to do, they were already thinking about what is the next step in terms of the implementation of this initiative. And I invite you all to follow these consultations. They are going to be consultations both at the global level, at the regional level, but also hopefully in the next step at the level of at the country level, in those places where we have youth networks in place. And that brings me to the second initiative, which is the establishment of national youth chapters that we are creating around the world as really comprehensive youth platforms for agri-food system work and initiatives, programs, projects that directly include youth as actors of change in country. And here we hope to see the next step after the consultations in the Youth Assembly to go, of course, in partnership with all those who are involved. But if you want to have a really comprehensive group of young people to work with that are active in agri-food systems, that are knowledgeable of the issues that you're talking about in this initiative, and that are motivated to really make a difference in this transformative process that we would like to see at the end of this initiative. These youth chapters are the place where we hope you will also go, and I'm sure in your implementation efforts this can be an interesting and important partner to consider. And finally, the Youth Assembly is putting recommendations in place. Some of these draft recommendations will be already presented at the UN Food System Summit +4 Stocktake as well. In most countries at this point, youth has been recognized also by the conveners in the different countries. Also, that it's going to be further discussed at the World Food Forum, as I was saying before, as this is the accumulation of the discussions of the Youth Assembly on an annual basis. And we will also support programs that can underpin the initiative in different programs that you can all see here in this QR code, not only on policy, but also in the field of education, innovation, and culture. We have heard before, young people are, they're not only policymakers, of course, they are primarily consumers, they're producers. They're also the guardians, very often, of traditional cuisines and cultural knowledge and heritage. So unless young people are being brought directly into the solutions, directly into the programs and projects that will be coming out of this initiative, this type of knowledge, this type of heritage will not be able to actually be sustained. So we invite you very much to consider youth here as a very active co-creator on the way forward. So to conclude, and I'm very happy that there are some young people also here in the room, and for those who are young and for those who are young at heart as well, that's everybody is welcome, of course. Join this consultation process ahead. I think we need every brain and every voice of young people that are interested to make a difference through these consultation processes, both in the Youth Assembly and also through the national networks, and ensure that not only your voices are heard, but also the voices of all those who perhaps are not heard in these processes. So we invite also at the national level, at the local level, at the provincial level, to have consultations on these issues and get involved, get active. To the membership here, nutrition and biodiversity is important to youth. There is no question here. There is also an understanding why this is important. So engage youth in your work ahead as co-creators for these solutions. And of course, my office is very happy to support you in this process, both locally and globally. And yeah, with that, I hand back to you, Patricia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So last but certainly not least, Mr. Pablo Ineken Zuniga, Technical Officer in FAO's Indigenous People Unit. Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much. And we believe that diversity of genetic resources is key to ensure healthy diets. And I would like to highlight three practical actions that the member states could strengthen in the recognition of nutrition schemes. The first is that indigenous people food and knowledge systems are key in addressing food insecurity and malnutrition. If you see and if you read the overarching section C of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it includes and highlights the relevance of indigenous people food and knowledge systems in addressing biodiversity loss, but also climate change, soil degradation, and the recognition of indigenous peoples as custodians of biodiversity, as partners also in biodiversity conservation, but not only conservation and protection, but also sustainable use. And in that case, we continue the work with sustainable food system, which is key if we have a sustainable use of biodiversity and is vital for nutrition. And Kavi already mentioned the impact of monocrops. Indigenous peoples in this case are key to preserve the genetic biodiversity. And for that reason, it's also important, the relevance to respect the collective rights of indigenous peoples over their lands, territories, and resources, which is also connected and recognized by the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, but also in the different FAO instruments, for example, in the FAO policy on indigenous and tribal people, in the environmental and social safeguards, the environmental and social safeguards 8, number 8 is related to indigenous peoples, and the relevance to the free, prior, and informed consent to protect indigenous peoples as custodians of biodiversity. As a second point, indigenous peoples are game changers in biodiversity conservation, and basically because the knowledge associated to the use of genetic resources, we already mentioned the relevance of the Commission of Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and indeed this last period of sessions, that was the 20th session, was the first time ever when indigenous peoples had a space to intervene in the different negotiations, but also with an statement. And the wording and narrative of indigenous peoples as custodians of genetic diversity has been recognized in 32 times in the reports of the Commission. So this is an open space that indigenous peoples are having within the organization, which is important to acknowledge their role, and not only as recipients of support, but as partners in the biodiversity conservation and in nutrition schemes. In this case, also it's important to recognize the connection that the FAO has with the Montreal GBF. In the Target 2, which is on ecosystem restoration, indigenous peoples are leading processes on indigenous restoration processes. And it is important to mention that the FAO is one of the custodians of the indicator of this target, which is also connected with food systems. Target 3 is fundamental because it recognizes not only conservation, but also sustainable use. And indigenous territory is recognized, not only protected areas and other effective-based conservation measures, but also indigenous territories. And for me, the indigenous territories are the perfect match between conservation and sustainable use, because the food systems are sustainable and are resilient. So this is also important. Target 10, we already mentioned the relevance of the agro-NBSAPs, and indigenous are key for sustainable food systems transformation. When we speak about indigenous peoples, we don't speak only about agro-food system. We speak about food system in a wider way, because we are including also the hunter and gatherer that had practices that precede agriculture, for example, and that are also maintaining the ecosystems alive. On Target 22, which is about indigenous knowledge, the FAO is one of the custodians also of the indicators of land tenure and land use, which is recognizing the collective rights of indigenous peoples and the role to ensure nutrition and to ensure the genetic diversity in the world. And the Target 22, which is related to women, it is connected with the role of women and also the indigenous women. And for that reason, we included here an image of the indigenous women as protectors of the environment, as the custodians of the genetic diversity, as the mothers of the earth, as the mothers of the soil, as the mothers of the biodiversity. And in this case, indigenous peoples recognize themselves not only as a stakeholder, but as rights and knowledge holders. And this is something fundamental to understand, and that member states should strengthen this recognition of the knowledge of indigenous peoples and the data sovereignty that they have. The third element that I would like to highlight is the role of the indigenous people food and knowledge systems in the Trivia Conventions, in particular with the Article 8J program of work, which is a program of work adopted by COP16 at the CBD, and that is recognizing the indigenous people's knowledge are connected with these genetic resources that they host. And the connection with other conventions, for example, with the UNCCD and the land degradation neutrality targets of the UNCCD, indigenous pastoralists and transhumans are fundamental to maintain those ecosystems alive. And we are working a lot, for example, in the frame of the International Year of Camelids and now the upcoming International Year of Rangelands to protect and recognize the role of indigenous peoples in those areas to combat desertification and soil degradation. Basically, also this is connected with the FAO strategic plan and the 4 Betters, because it's not only better nutrition and better environment, but also better life and better production. It's sustainable production. And finally, I would like also to mention as one of the practical platforms that we have. FAO hosts the Global Hub of Indigenous People Food Systems, adopted by the Committee of Agriculture, the COAC, which is a think tank of researchers, indigenous and non-indigenous, from different organizations and universities that join together, and we try to connect together to put at the same level the indigenous knowledge and the scientific of formal knowledge in a way to create and co-create knowledge. We have, for example, the University of Cambridge, the University of Harvard, but also indigenous universities, such as the Universidad Maya de Quintana Roo. We have different experts, and they are working in different instruments. We put here together some of the elements and publications that they have. They have been working in one publication of labeling and certification, which is fundamental regarding nutrition schemes and food systems transformation. And also the recognition of indigenous people's food in quality terms. There is also a publication on collective rights of indigenous peoples. There are also a publication of poverty, because for indigenous peoples, poverty is different than poverty for us. For example, for them, poverty is being in between different walls, and for them, being rich is being in the forest when you can collect the food and you can produce your food. And in the frame of the work of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, we are working in the Indigenous Peoples Biocentric Restoration Global Program, which is also to recognize the cosmogony and this spiritual connection of the indigenous with the environment, with the nutrition, with the seeds, with the pollinators. And basically, we are happy to work together. The FAO is open to contribute in these spaces. We are having the in-person meeting of the Global Hub on Indigenous People Food Systems in the Indigenous Nomadic Tent during the World Food Forum. And we will have different advocacy events and different sessions to advance in this kind of work. For example, the Global Hub is now producing also a document on the impact of ultra-processed food on indigenous peoples and the impact of monocrops, and how monocrops are destroying the genetic diversity that at the end is fundamental to maintain ecosystems balance and ecosystems alive. But FAO is working in these processes. I think that the practical action is to invite member states to continue in promoting the narrative to include and recognize indigenous peoples as knowledge holders, the role of indigenous peoples as partners in sustainable development, as partners in food systems transformation, and as partners in environmental protection and conservation and sustainable use. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We are inviting now our experts to leave the podium, and I would like to invite for the second panel our distinguished guest. Come stiamo con l'orario? Sono le 4:30. Ah, vabbè, se allora ce la facciamo. We are having a very rich session, and I hope that you have taken many ideas and that you feel inspired for the development of the action plan that is part of this initiative. Now I would like to invite our distinguished panelists to reflect on what they have heard and enrich this discussion. I have one question that is the same for everyone, and it is, how do you envision sustaining efforts under the initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition based on successful examples from your country or your collaboration with Rome-based agencies and partners? First, allow me to invite Her Excellency Cristina Bende, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the United Nations Organization in Rome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have interpretation here? No, okay. No, just to okay. Hello again. So after Brazil and giving a good example of Switzerland would be a challenge because our country is slightly less biodiverse, I would say. But I would like to maybe recall some of the examples that we have been going through with Switzerland's reality since the beginning of the week. And also maybe add a little international dimension to this, the Swiss action internationally. So first of all, it is clear that in our view, the latest food pyramid that we have now developed for the next 7 to 8 years, comprising the element of sustainable development is in a way our link to how nutrition should also not only respect biodiversity, but also enhance biodiversity. So this is, I think, an example of now to be implemented, of course, of how we see a different way of looking at what are you doing when you're talking about implementing a food pyramid. How do you do it if you have to also consider sustainable development, especially the environmental side? In addition, I would like to say that a little bit less than 2 years ago, we have also introduced a new strategy for agriculture in respect of climate change for agriculture. So the idea here is to make the next agriculture policy a kind of more holistic through the value chain agriculture policy, also taking into account nutrition and in respect of the engagements of Switzerland according to the UN Climate Change Convention. And this is something where we still have to reflect on how the diversity that we still have today, and it's more on the side of course, vegetable crops than animal biodiversity, how this agro-biodiversity can be enhanced and also pushed forward for a better agriculture policy in the future. I don't want to go now into the details of the measures because it's not yet adopted, but this strategy should drive us to the next agriculture policy. In addition, I want to mention here maybe the support of the true cost study, the true cost accounting study for Switzerland, which also shows what happens if you don't take into account. And I think my colleague from Brazil in the previous panel alluded also to the externalities that you can create, that if you don't consider them, what you are up to losing. If you don't consider biodiversity and other externalities and other costs, hidden costs of an agriculture and a consumption activity. And finally, at the international level, I just want to mention that Switzerland is very engaged in projects which consider the nutrition under the angle of underutilized and neglected species. So I just want to mention Crops for HD, Crops for Healthy Diets, a project that Switzerland supports very thoroughly and with great, I think, innovative ideas. I was lately in Tanzania. I saw the effects of such projects, and I think it's something that brings a lot of food for thought that we could maybe bring back one day to Switzerland and having something, coherent at the national level. And finally, I would say that for the RBAs, just to finish on that, I think this week is just the proof that everything is linked and that people should talk together. So when you meet in the catering areas, but not only in the rooms, you can see how people talk together and come together and cannot avoid anymore this coherence which is needed in the action of not only the agencies in Rome, but also the agencies outside of Rome. And just want to mention, for example, the One Health approach, which is the approach. This week we have a One Planet Summit also in Brazil that tries to also stimulate this kind of reflection about how to collaborate at the UN level, and then to bring this, like the alliance which Brazil will be talking about, brings together also on the ground. So that would be my very short piece on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and also to remind us that the collaboration comes from engaging, because we are all coming from different disciplines and learning from each other. Allow me now to welcome Mr. Vicente Amaral Becerra, Counselor and alternate permanent representative of the Federative Republic of Brazil to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The floor is yours.
Thank you and good afternoon. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I think so much has been said so far that it's difficult to react. Actually, some of my talking points were already presented here.
Alignment.
So I think I can take from there, and they left me in a very good position actually, and I think it's a very constructive engagement that you are providing here. And I would like to focus on three things, kind of building on what has been said. The first two, more into some of the policies in Brazil, which is the first part of your question, and that's my third comment would be on our experience with the RPAs and how do we see a contribution from this initiative. So, well, I think that there's a lot of innovation in Brazil in terms of linking biodiversity and food security policies, poverty reduction policies as well, development policies in general. Maybe for the simple fact that we are a biodiverse country and we're trying to make a living out of the biodiversity in a sustainable way, to put it in a very simple terms. We have, for example, and this is always mentioned in many international events, we have like 30 million people living in Amazon forest, and people need to work decently and provide for their families and their livelihoods. So that's a strong political drive in search for solutions, policy and market solutions, and some of those solutions were mentioned here. I was very glad to hear the science policy interface that is behind some of our national programs on like the school meals policy and the public acquisition policy. And that would be my first comment. I think if there's something from our national experience that I would mention is the institutional demand, scaling biodiversity through public procurement. That has been in our national school feeding program, 30% of school meals. The program in total serves 40 million students per day. So 30% of that food comes from family, it's mandatory to come from family farms, prioritizing biodiverse foods like cassava, regional fruits and legumes. On the top of that, recommendations and regulations and policy incentives try to create further incentives to that, so that food is actually biodiverse and not only locally procured. So again, I mentioned an example from the Amazon state, one of where we have the lowest per capita level in Brazil. School procurement of açaí and pupunha, which are two Amazon fruits, increased by 45% since 2023 due to new policy instruments that were adopted in the new government, benefiting 12,000 agro-extractive families. So it's a big impact in the short term. Of course, that builds on a basis that were already there, of some pilots that were being conducted, but still. So institutional demand can play an important role, and that would be my first comment. The second one, it was already mentioned, I think from Caver, I think it mentioned it, policy integration. Another big topic, but basically linking biodiversity to health and agriculture in a way. The dietary guidelines were already mentioned as well, one of my key points, so I don't need to repeat that. A key instrument, I think that we see there's a lot of data showing it's critical and actual impact on the ground. But I would mention another one, the productive forest programs. Again, a new policy that is building on pilots and now became a national policy from the Ministry of the Agricultural Development, basically transforming degraded lands into sustainable agroforestry systems. Environmental restoration, socioeconomic benefits for rural communities. That's the new incentive, aligning different incentives for other policies into this, allow us also to achieve the climate compliance that we are also working towards, supporting our commitments to the Paris Agreement and reducing and capturing carbon and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously promoting socioeconomic inclusion in rural areas where we have the highest level of poverty in our country. So this kind of integration that we are trying to build in the productive forest wants also to shows the kind of the change of paradigm that we had in many areas in terms of when it comes to sustainably producing. That resulted in a new strategy, a bioeconomy national strategy, which is being developed into different streams of policies to try to give more coherence in terms of policy, including for communication purposes. But the core aspect of it is that through this kind of local focus that we could see in the local procurement policy, and also building on policy integration and trying to channel the incentives, for example, the climate finance or goals and other incentives that we have in this field, we are kind of creating new sorts of policies, hopefully very effective to achieve those goals, and the outcomes have been very positive so far, that I would mention as successful examples that we use for examples for this initiative. And my third comment to conclude builds on what you just said, Patricia, in the terms of collaboration and different perspectives. Then I would have two comments. The first one, mentioned by our ambassador from Switzerland, is the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger. In which sense? In two aspects. The first one in terms of policy integration. We had in that policy in that initiative, a strong component of trying to raise the level of commitment in terms of fighting poverty and hunger. And one of the initiatives, for example, is to include those policies and articulate them into the nationally determined contributions into the Paris Agreement. So the Global Alliance provided some guidance to its members in that sense on how that could be done and how that can be done. Let's move to the how, as was the idea of the event. And then we have the second aspect of the Global Alliance, which is an interesting one, also experimental in some sense, which is the policy basket. The policy basket is the core of the Global Alliance, a set of policy instruments backed by strong data and tested in different countries that can be proved efficient to address the goals of the alliance in case, but also could be a sort of design for an initiative that try to trigger a specific policy, building on the low-hanging fruits that were mentioned here also as well. And last but not least, also regional partnerships. And I would mention specifically in the Amazon, we had in 2023, the Amazon Declaration, and now we have an initiative also from FAO on Amazon bioeconomy, and that's also a very interesting point of entry, building on those regional initiatives, because they're actually building synergies among countries that can allow for acceleration of results. In the Amazon specifically, we had a very interesting discussion, including with some youth engagement as drivers of change, and it's a very youth region in Brazil, but showing on the high level of engagement into transformative approaches that are shared among our region and are building very promising, sharing of experiences and goals, not only in terms of biodiversity and nutrition, but also, again, into this broader framework of how can we live in a biodiverse region, produce, sustain, and thrive. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for also bringing this coherence between evidence, policy, and also financial incentive. So let me please invite Mr. Martin de Groot, Counselor, Permanent Representation of Canada to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Mr. de Groot, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting us to think about how to sustain this, because I think ultimately that's the key question. How do we sustain and hopefully expand and get better and bigger in how we engage in this space. And I think it's encouraging for us to hear cross linkages already with the previous panel that had all sort of the technical insights to give us a sense that hopefully we're going in the right direction. You'll hear some similar comments from my colleagues, because for Canada, it comes down to both policy and programming action. For us, it's about focusing on the local stakeholders that sort of sit between that biodiversity and nutrition space, and with action both domestically and internationally. So looking first in Canada, our food policy makes the connection between nutrition and biodiversity, and with a special focus on recognizing the role of Indigenous communities and traditional foods in that role. And as an example, there's efforts to promote traditional foods in the Yukon, generating fact sheets that identify the nutrition and health benefits and values associated with traditionally harvested products that are in our north. We're also supporting production and trade of traditional foods through funding that's linked to our implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, so that ties to Pablo's presentation earlier. Internationally, and was great to have the CBD Secretariat speak at the outset, it comes from really big engagement, sort of at a global scale, where we were very happy to provide the biggest and first contribution to the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund in 2023. But bringing it down a little bit more to the specific investments in an international context, and seeing CIAT Biodiversity sitting at the end of the podium here, we were happy in 2022 in the G20 summit to provide a contribution of nearly $10 million to a project called, and it's a good title, Biodiversity for Resilient Ecosystems in Agricultural Landscapes, which is Be Real. So we want to be real when it comes to this space. And really it comes down to those four elements that you kicked us off with for the CBD FAO initiative. Part of it is supporting the management of 40,000 hectares of land and planting 100,000 native trees across 30 different species in Kenya, in Peru, and in Colombia, with those species being selected for their nutritional value, as well as their local relevance and soil management practices. And that delivers on element 3 of the initiative to conserve and promote biodiversity for food and nutrition. The partnership with CIAT Biodiversity advances on element 2, the integration into research and policy, and especially focuses on that co-creation with local stakeholders that I think is really fundamental to make it real. And then finally, as the results are being achieved, the new findings on these species and their contribution to nutritional outcomes feeds into that wider knowledge exchange and hopefully builds that public awareness. And I wouldn't want to end without reflecting on how it's important to tackle biodiversity and nutrition without a focus on gender equality issues. Women and men farmers, youth, Kazuki, and Indigenous peoples. So for the Be Real project, we partnered with the Coady Institute to support gender transformative leadership and community-based training, reflecting the fact that we really need to leverage that knowledge that comes from diverse stakeholders, from women, from youth whose voices aren't always heard. And that requires an intentional approach to invest in that and make sure that those voices are heard, integrated, and acted upon. And so ultimately, empowering local actors from the research side to the field to the markets, which is an important element to make sure that it has an economic dimension as well. We believe that we can identify, implement, and sustain those solutions that we're looking for. Thank you.
So much. And thank you for this emphasis on stay real and of the importance of really recognizing knowledge and evidence. Let me now welcome Mr. Anthony Murithi for the permanent representation of the Republic of Kenya to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Mr. Murithi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and also thank you to the distinguished panelists here and also the distinguished audience also before me. Thank you. I think Kenya, to start with, is home to a wide diversity of food species, including wild edibles, local animal breeds, and food crops, with varieties more nutritious than typical food commodities. I'm glad to note that our research institution, the Kenya Agriculture and Livestock Research Organization, in partnership with the Ministry of Health and Agriculture, as well as FAO, has generated information on the nutrient content of a number of indigenous species and prepared recipes using these key ingredients. As a country, we recognize that sustaining efforts under the Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition Initiative requires a multifaceted approach that balances conservation, policy support, and community engagement. We have been able to conduct studies on local addresses of figure millet at Babaranat and compare their nutritional value to improved varieties. Findings show that local figure millet contains 6 times more iron and twice as much fiber as maize, while Barbara groundnuts has higher fiber and potassium content. We also work in mainstreaming biodiversity in national nutritional policies, and this is part of the Nutrition Interagency Coordination Committee, which links biodiversity to food-based interventions to combat malnutrition. This initiative has worked closely with policy stakeholders from Busia County in Western Kenya to develop a biodiversity conservation policy that takes into account the importance of conserving nutrient-rich traditional foods such as cowpeas, amaranth, cedar leaf, and spider plants to increase diet quality and access to key micronutrients, particularly for mothers and children. This process has culminated in the endorsement of the first ever biodiversity conservation policy for Kenya's 47 counties. This policy recognizes the importance of traditional foods for nutrition and food security and has allocated resources to conserve regional food biodiversity with specific provisions for designated conservation areas and further incorporation of native species into school meals and linking smallholder farmers to institutional markets. We are further engaged on climate-smart agriculture to ensure biodiversity conservation aligns with food security goals. Our approach combines scientific research, policy integration, and grassroots engagement to ensure biodiversity remains central to our food security efforts in Kenya, where we recognize access to food as a basic right. So I thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for mentioning the importance of the food composition. And in fact, we will have an event, I think, on Friday on that. So thank you so much, distinguished guests, for your reflection. Unfortunately, we don't have time for the question and answer because we ran out of time. So I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Juan Lucas Restrepo, Director General of the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, for the closing remarks. And I really thank you for my distinguished panelists for this second session.
Thanks a lot. And let me first make a comment, which is that I love the Q&A part of these meetings. I think it's where you get a lot of value. That we need to rethink meetings so there is real exchange. Fish bowls, there is a lot of formats emerging that allow for that. So it's not just listening and taking notes, but really exchanging, which is very important and needed. Just to say 3 points, I really enjoyed listening to cases from the experts, listening from the countries, representatives whom we have been engaging for a long time, as well as FAO and other colleagues. So what I get from this meeting, from what I heard, there's 3 important things that I'm kind of taking home. The first one is, and that's where Kaveh started, we need to really work at the nexus of biodiversity, nutrition, and agriculture. Sectoral, siloed, vertical approaches, we don't have the luxury anymore. We cannot think about a commitment towards climate or biodiversity without understanding the trade-offs and hopefully pathways that allow us multiple wins and of course minimal losses across these options that governments and we are facing every day. And this is something that needs to be understood across sectors and across scales, and hopefully something we keep pushing forward. So we're finally hearing about this nexus approach, etc. We're not there yet, but let's leave this room committed, for example, that in the UNFSS +4 in Ethiopia, we keep pushing, as in the COP30 and other spaces for this approach. So that's kind of my first takeaway. The second one is that we cannot think that we have all of the tools in the toolkit and all of the knowledge. There is a lot of knowledge, there is a lot of evidence that we can profit from, and we're doing it, but there is still elements, even very basic, that we are learning about. So we are part of this consortia called PTFI, the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, where we are understanding, again, in a deeper way, what's in the food in our plates. In terms of the crops, what changes as we process it and the different cultural ways of consuming it, not on the basic known nutrients, but in more complex micronutrients and different compounds and elements that we are learning from basic research that are very functional to nutrition and to health. So let's make sure we are always open to challenge our guidelines and to keep open for this new knowledge to show up and invest in it, of course. But then, of course, and we heard this very clear, the local ways, the local knowledge, what the communities need to add to the mix in terms of their knowledge needs to be part of solutions that are contextualized. And then my third one related to the other two is that and I can say that this is something we see in a very polarized world at the moment. If we just look at the politics, we are quite easily brought into becoming dogmatic, and we are seeking for where are these silver bullets that will just have this fantastic solution, one size fits all. And well, there are not many, if any, silver bullets around. We need to understand that that solutions need to be contextualized, that of course there are common elements, and that's why we're here to share, to learn from experiences from others, but at the end of the day we need to adopt to adapt, and that's going to be absolutely critical, and we cannot be brought into these discussions whether a solution in a specific local context is through an agroecological transition or a sustainable intensification type of transition, or if the animal-sourced foods should be there or not. So we need, in this balance, in this nexus, that will help us understand what are those solutions that we need to bring to be real, I would say, in terms of context as well. And I'll give you one last example of this dogmatic. We have a lot of push because the normalized commercial seed sector is critical to move forward food production and productivity, etc. Sure, it's very important. And then we have people saying, no, it's the seed banks and the local communities that need to make sure that they have access to this biodiversity so they can provide for themselves. Yes, that's beautiful as well, but if we bring the two together, which is the case for many communities, where we see in Kenya, for example, community seed banks that are bringing leafy vegetables and minor cereals and a number of very important crops for their customs and their nutrition, that are able to provide for themselves maybe 30% of the requirements for planting material on their fields. But at the same time, they bring into their fields commercial varieties, new varieties that complement the mix. So just to signal, let's make sure we are context specific and that we meet these nexus solutions without any kind of dogmatic approach or looking at silver bullets that are probably not around. So thank you for this afternoon. It's been very nurturing for myself and hopefully for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. And I really hope that we can continue this discussion. And next time we will really just bring this insight and have 3/4 of the time on question and answer. So we could change the format.
Yeah, and let me, in the name of the Colombian ambassador, because an empty seat is always challenging, she was confident that there would have been translation because she was ready to speak in Spanish. So it was kind of an unfortunately technical misunderstanding. That's why she's not here.
Okay. Thank you. I apologize. Thank you.